They weren't searching for history, they were searching for water. In March 1974, farmers near Xi'an in China's Shanxi province began digging a well during a drought. A few feet below the surface, their tools struck fragments of clay. At first, nothing suggested they had uncovered one of the greatest archaeological discoveries in human history. Then, more fragments appeared. Archaeologists were called in, excavations expanded. What emerged from the earth was astonishing. Rows of life-size soldiers standing in military formation beneath the ground. Not dozens, not hundreds, thousands. Each with different facial features, different ranks, different equipment, and different positions within a military structure. An entire army had been hidden underground for more than 2,000 years. Most people stop there. The army becomes the story. I don't think that's the most interesting part. The soldiers are evidence. The real mystery is the decision behind them. Because this army was never meant to be seen. It wasn't standing in a public square. It wasn't guarding a palace. It wasn't built as a monument for future generations. It was buried, deliberately, which creates a question historians still wrestle with today. Why would an emperor spend enormous resources constructing an underground world that almost nobody was ever supposed to witness? The answer begins with the man buried at its center. In 221 BCE, Qin Shi Huang became the first ruler to unify the major states of China under a single imperial government. After centuries of warfare between rival kingdoms, he achieved what many believed was impossible. His government standardized currency, weights, measurements, and writing systems across vast territories. This wasn't simply military victory. It was administrative consolidation on a massive scale. The modern Chinese state is separated from Qin Shi Huang by more than 2 millennia, but many historians still view his reign as a foundational moment in Chinese political history. Yet there was a contradiction at the heart of his rule. The emperor who defeated rival states became increasingly concerned with defeating death. Ancient records describe repeated searches for immortality. Expeditions were sent in search of mythical solutions. Court advisors promoted remedies that promised eternal life. The most powerful man in China could command armies. He could not command time. That obsession matters because it changes how we interpret what happened next. Construction of the emperor's mausoleum complex began long before his death. Historical accounts describe hundreds of thousands of laborers participating in the project over decades. And the Terracotta Army was only one part of it. Modern surveys suggest the broader complex covers dozens of square kilometers. The soldiers occupy only a fraction of the site. Think about the scale. This wasn't a tomb in the ordinary sense. It was an underground system, a carefully organized world built beneath the surface. The soldiers themselves reveal that intention. They were arranged according to military doctrine. Officers occupied specific positions. Infantry, cavalry, and chariots were deployed in structured formations. Nothing about the layout appears random. This wasn't decoration, it was organization. Almost as if the emperor expected the machinery of his empire to continue operating after his death. One dry observation: many rulers wanted loyal soldiers. Qin Shi Huang appears to have commissioned an entirely new army rather than take any chances. But even that explanation leaves something unresolved. If the goal was simply protection in the afterlife, why bury everything so deeply? Why hide one of the largest construction projects of the ancient world beneath layers of earth? That question leads directly to the center of the complex, because beyond the soldiers lies a sealed burial chamber that archaeologists have still not opened. And according to some of the oldest historical accounts we possess, what may be inside is stranger than the army guarding it. At the center of this story is a room nobody has entered. The Terracotta Army attracts the headlines because it is visible. Tourists can walk through the excavation pits and see thousands of soldiers standing where they were placed more than 2,000 years ago. The emperor's actual burial chamber is different. It remains sealed. Not because archaeologists lack interest, quite the opposite. The chamber may contain some of the most valuable historical evidence ever discovered. The problem is preservation. Researchers fear that opening the tomb with current technology could damage artifacts that have survived since the 3rd century BCE. So the most important room in the complex remains untouched. That decision becomes more interesting when we look at the historical records. Around a century after Qin Shi Huang's death, the historian Sima Qian wrote an account of the mausoleum in his Records of the Grand Historian. According to his description, the burial chamber contained palaces, treasures, and a miniature version of the emperor's empire. Then comes the detail that has fascinated historians for generations: mercury rivers. Sima Qian claimed that craftsmen recreated China's major waterways using flowing mercury beneath the tomb. For a long time, many scholars treated the story cautiously. Ancient writers sometimes exaggerated. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Then scientists began studying the soil around the burial mound. They discovered unusually high mercury concentrations in several locations surrounding the site. This does not prove every detail of Sima Qian's account, but it does something almost as important. It makes the story plausible. Suddenly, the ancient historian no longer looked like a man telling legends. He looked like someone who may have been describing a real engineering project. And that changes how we think about the entire complex. Because if the emperor truly ordered the construction of an underground empire, complete with symbolic rivers and administrative structures, then the mausoleum was not merely a grave. It was a model of the world. Remember the contradiction from part 1. Qin Shi Huang spent years searching for immortality. Most discussions stop there and treat the project as evidence of personal fear. I think the evidence points somewhere slightly different. The emperor had already unified China. He had standardized systems across enormous distances. His greatest achievement was not military conquest alone. It was creating order. The mausoleum appears to reflect that same obsession. Excavations around the complex have uncovered more than soldiers. Archaeologists have found officials, servants, entertainers, horses, and administrative figures. An army protects something. A government manages something. The presence of both suggests a larger vision. What seems to have been buried beneath the earth was not just a ruler. It was an entire state. There is a tendency to view ancient tombs as expressions of religion. Sometimes that is correct, but the Qin Mausoleum feels unusually political. Every major component reflects organization, hierarchy, and control. The same principles that defined the emperor's reign above ground appear again below ground, almost as though he intended to preserve the structure of his empire itself. And here is where the story takes an unexpected turn. The project succeeded archaeologically. It failed politically. Qin Shi Huang died in 210 BCE. Within only a few years, the Qin dynasty collapsed. The empire he worked so hard to secure proved far less durable than the underground world he left behind. Think about that for a moment. Hundreds of thousands of workers spent decades building a monument to permanence. The government it represented disappeared almost immediately. The soldiers survived. The dynasty didn't. That contrast matters because it forces us to reconsider what the Terracotta Army actually represents. Most people see a symbol of power. Increasingly, historians see something else, a symbol of anxiety. An emperor who had conquered rival kingdoms discovered there was one problem he could not solve. No military campaign could stop mortality. No administrative reform could guarantee eternal control. The underground city may have been his answer. The scale of the Terracotta Army is impressive. The individuality is harder to explain. When archaeologists first began uncovering the warriors, many assumed they were seeing mass-produced figures. That would have made sense. The project involved thousands of statues created within a limited period of time. Standardization would have been the logical approach. Instead, researchers found something unexpected. Different facial structures, different hairstyles, different expressions, different ranks and uniforms. At first glance, many of the warriors appear unique. That discovery produced a popular theory. Perhaps each statue represented a real soldier who had served the emperor. It's an appealing idea. It makes the army feel personal rather than symbolic. The evidence, however, is mixed. Detailed analysis suggests the craftsmen used a modular production system. Heads, arms, hands, torsos, and other components were produced separately and assembled in different combinations. Artists then added individual details afterward. In modern terms, it was something between mass production and customization. 2,000 years before industrial manufacturing, Qin artisans had developed a remarkably efficient system for producing large numbers of complex figures without making them look identical. That alone deserves attention. We're often taught to think of ancient states as technologically limited, yet the Qin government was managing supply chains, labor forces, quality control systems, and production methods on a scale that many pre-modern societies never approached. The army tells us as much about administration as it does about art. And that brings us to an uncomfortable question: who built it? Historical sources describe vast numbers of laborers working on the mausoleum complex. Estimates vary, and ancient figures should always be treated carefully, but there is little doubt that construction demanded enormous human effort. Many workers likely spent years on the project. Some spent decades, not because they wanted to create a masterpiece for future museum visitors, because the state ordered it. This is where modern interpretations often divide. One view sees the mausoleum as evidence of extraordinary organization and capability. Another sees it as evidence of authoritarian excess. Both arguments have merit. Without centralized power, a project of this scale would almost certainly have been impossible. With centralized power, the human cost became enormous. History rarely offers clean moral verdicts. The same government that standardized systems across China also imposed heavy demands on its population. The same emperor remembered as a unifier is also remembered for harsh rule. Those two realities exist together. And this is where the story takes its most important turn. For decades, people have treated the Terracotta Army as the main event. I think that's backwards. The soldiers are not the destination. They're a warning sign pointing towards something larger. Remember the question from part 1? Why bury everything? The answer may be that the army was never intended to communicate with future generations. It was intended to serve a single audience, the emperor himself. That changes the meaning of the site completely. Monuments are built for observers. This wasn't. The soldiers were positioned where almost nobody would ever see them. Their details required immense effort, despite being hidden underground. The broader complex was constructed beneath layers of earth rather than displayed above it. In practical terms, this was one of the most expensive private projects in human history. Not private in ownership, private in audience. The emperor wasn't building a legacy, he was building continuity, a world he believed he might still need. That's the reversal at the heart of the entire story. The Terracotta Army is usually presented as a symbol of confidence and power. The evidence points towards something more complicated. It may also be a symbol of uncertainty. A ruler who conquered kingdoms still felt compelled to prepare for what came next. A man who unified China still invested extraordinary resources into protecting a future nobody could verify. Power had limits. He knew it. The sealed tomb gets most of the attention. That's understandable. Human beings are naturally drawn to unopened doors. The possibility that mercury rivers, lost artifacts, or unknown treasures still exist beneath the burial mound creates a mystery that feels almost irresistible. But I think the most important secret of this underground city is not waiting inside the chamber. It's already visible. We just tend to look past it. Consider what survived. Not the Qin dynasty, not the officials who served it, not the political arguments of the period, not the ambitions of rival kingdoms. What survived was the system, the idea that a vast territory could be governed through centralized administration, the idea that standards could be imposed across enormous distances, the idea that state institutions could outlast individual rulers. Qin Shi Huang did not invent every one of these concepts, but he demonstrated them at a scale that permanently altered Chinese history. Ironically, the dynasty itself lasted only about 15 years after unification. By historical standards, that's remarkably brief. Many observers stop there and conclude that the project failed. I'm not convinced. The dynasty collapsed. The framework didn't. Later Chinese states inherited, adapted, and expanded many of the administrative foundations established during the Qin period. The political structure evolved, sometimes dramatically, but the basic principle of a unified Chinese state endured. In a strange way, the emperor achieved a version of what he wanted, not immortality for himself, continuity for the system. That doesn't mean every decision he made was wise. Far from it. Heavy taxation, forced labor, and harsh legal policies contributed to instability after his death. There is a reason the dynasty unraveled so quickly. The counter-argument is entirely valid. If the emperor was truly building something permanent, why did it fall apart almost immediately? Because durability and survival are not always the same thing. A government can disappear while its ideas remain. History is full of examples. The Roman Republic vanished. Its influence did not. Ancient Athens lost its power. Its political concepts survived. The Qin dynasty collapsed. Its impact remained embedded in the state that followed. That's why I think the Terracotta Army is often misunderstood. People see thousands of soldiers and imagine military strength. I see an administrative document written in clay. Every rank, formation, and carefully organized unit reflects a ruler obsessed with structure. The army was not merely protecting an emperor in the afterlife. It was expressing how he understood the world. Ordered, managed, controlled. And yet there is one final irony. For all the resources devoted to preserving that vision, the most valuable part of the site today is not political at all. It's archaeological. The underground city became a time capsule, a frozen record of how one of history's most consequential states saw itself at the moment of its greatest confidence and perhaps its greatest anxiety. Because confidence and anxiety often travel together. The more power someone accumulates, the more they have to lose. Qin Shi Huang unified kingdoms, commanded armies, and reshaped a civilization. Yet the existence of the mausoleum suggests he remained deeply concerned about what came after. Not just after death, after him. My prediction is that the tomb chamber will remain sealed for longer than many people expect. Archaeologists have waited decades because they know that once it is opened, there is no second attempt. Future technology will almost certainly reveal more than current methods can. Patience is frustrating. In this case, it's probably the correct decision. And if the chamber is eventually opened, I suspect the greatest discovery won't be gold, weapons, or hidden treasures. It will be evidence that confirms something we already suspect. The underground city was never primarily about death. It was about permanence. Whether Qin Shi Huang succeeded depends on how you define success. The man died, the dynasty fell. Yet more than 2,000 years later, we're still discussing a project he ordered into existence. That's a longer lifespan than most empires ever achieve. If you enjoyed this deep dive into history's biggest mysteries, stick around for the next one. There are few places on Earth where archaeology and power intersect as clearly as they do here. An emperor built an army that was never meant to fight. 2,000 years later, it's still carrying out its mission.